At just 19 years old, the sole inheritance I received from my father's billion-dollar empire was a garbage bag filled with wet clothes and the crushing sound of a heavy door slamming shut behind me. I was homeless, freezing, and completely broken. But then I discovered a rusted brass key hidden inside his old fishing gear. That key would expose every single lie. The rain in Lake Forest, Illinois during late October carries a unique kind of cold. It doesn't merely dampen your skin, it penetrates straight through to your bones. That was the afternoon my stepmother, Victoria, decided my presence was no longer welcome. I stood on the grand limestone porch of the $14 million estate I had called home my entire life, clutching a black heavy-duty garbage bag. Inside were some jeans, a few t-shirts, and my father's old green fishing tackle box, the only possession I managed to grab from his study before security guards physically forced me down the stairs. Victoria stood safely behind the glass of the double front doors, wrapped in a cashmere shawl that likely cost more than a decent used car. Beside her stood her biological son, Preston. He was 22. Freshly graduated from an Ivy League school my father had fully paid for, and he wore a smirk I will never, ever forget. "You're 19, Samuel." Victoria's voice slipped through the crack in the door just before she closed it permanently. "Legally an adult. Your father is gone and your free ride is finished. The estate belongs to me now. If you set foot on this property again, I will have you arrested for trespassing." Then the deadbolt clicked. The finality of that sound echoed in my ears as I walked down the long, sweeping driveway, the rain soaking my hair and plastering it to my forehead. My father, Robert Wyatt, had built a massive logistics software company entirely from nothing. He was exceptionally brilliant, but his fatal weakness was his heart, both physically and emotionally. He loved too easily, which is precisely how Victoria, a former corporate consultant with eyes like frozen glass, manipulated her way into our lives 5 years ago. 6 months ago, my father suffered a sudden massive coronary failure. It was devastating and completely unexpected. The real shock, however, came during the reading of his will. Ted Higgins, the family lawyer who had attended my Little League games and sat at our Thanksgiving table for over a decade, refused to even make eye contact with me. He stared at his legal pad, his voice completely devoid of emotion, as he announced that my father had revised his will just 3 weeks before his death. The new document left absolutely everything: the company, the real estate, all liquid assets, the offshore accounts, entirely to Victoria. I was left with a single insulting clause: a one-time payment of $10,000, which Victoria subsequently claimed was tied up in probate and refused to release. I was effectively destroyed. For the first 2 weeks, I lived in my beat-up 2008 Honda Civic. I parked in the back corners of Walmart parking lots, rationing cheap crackers and peanut butter, waking up shivering at 3 in the morning with the windows completely frosted over from my own breath. The sheer betrayal paralyzed me completely. How could my father, who used to call me his anchor, leave me to starve on the streets? It made absolutely no sense. None of it made any sense. It wasn't until my 3rd week of living in the Civic that I finally opened that green tackle box. I was sitting under the dim, flickering amber light of a street lamp, the engine idling to squeeze a few minutes of heat into the cabin. I unlatched the rusty metal clasps, expecting to find nothing but tangled fishing line, dried rubber worms, and rusty hooks from our trips to Lake Michigan. I ran my fingers over the plastic dividers, tears welling in my eyes as the smell of stale lake water and old metal brought back memories of a time when my life felt safe and secure. But as I pressed down on the bottom tray, it shifted. I froze instantly. I pushed the plastic divider again. It gave way with a soft clicking sound. My heart began hammering wildly in my chest. I wedged my car keys under the edge of the plastic and pried it upward, a false bottom, Beneath the tray, resting on the dark green plastic, was a small velvet pouch and a folded piece of yellow legal paper. My hands trembled violently as I unfolded the paper. It was my father's handwriting, rushed, slanted, almost frantic. "Sammy, if you are reading this, the worst has happened. Do not trust Victoria. Do not trust Ted Higgins. They have been maneuvering against me for months, and my heart medication makes my head too foggy to fight them. I know they are doctoring the legal documents. I don't have much time. I left you nothing on paper because she would find a way to take it. Go to the First National Bank downtown, Box 402. Use this. I love you, son. Look up, Dad." I dumped the velvet pouch into my palm. Out slid a sleek silver safety deposit box key. The next morning, using the last 2 gallons of gas in my tank, I drove to downtown Chicago. I walked into the grand marble lobby of the First National Bank, wearing wrinkled clothes and 3 days of beard stubble. The bank manager eyed me with deep suspicion, but I had my driver's license and the key. 10 minutes later, I sat in a private viewing room with a long metal box resting on the mahogany table in front of me. I opened the lid. Inside, there was no cash. There were no gold bars. There was only a single manila folder. I opened it to find a property deed registered to a shell company called Blue Heron Holdings, LLC. Attached was a notarized document naming me as the sole proprietor, effectively hiding my ownership from any personal probate searches Victoria might have run. The property was in Black River Falls, a heavily forested rural area in central Wisconsin. Also in the folder was a brass key with a piece of masking tape reading, "Front Door." I stared at the deed, a property in Wisconsin. I had never once heard my father mention Black River Falls. Why would a billionaire tech mogul own a secret property in the middle of nowhere? I had no money, but I had a destination. I pawned my father's old fishing reels for $80, filled my gas tank, bought a loaf of bread, and pointed my car north. The drive took 5 hours. By the time I crossed the Wisconsin border, gray clouds had thickened, casting a gloomy, oppressive twilight over the dense pine forests. The GPS coordinates led me off the interstate, down winding county highways, and eventually onto an unmarked, unpaved logging road that threatened to tear the suspension right out from under my Civic. I drove another 3 miles, branches scraping against my windows like skeletal fingers. Finally, the trees broke, revealing a small, overgrown clearing. I parked the car and killed the engine. The silence of the deep woods rushed in, thick and heavy. I stepped out, my boots sinking into damp, decaying leaves, and stared at my inheritance. It was a massive letdown. I don't know what I had been expecting. A modern bunker, a luxurious hidden cabin. Instead, sitting in the center of the clearing was a dilapidated 2-story A-frame farmhouse. The white paint was peeling off the siding in long, curled strips. One of the front windows was boarded up, and the porch roof sagged dangerously. It looked abandoned for at least 20 years. "This is it," I whispered to the empty woods. A wave of bitter disappointment washed over me. Maybe my father's mind really had been deteriorating. Maybe this was worthless junk he had forgotten. But I had driven all this way, and I had nowhere else to go. I walked up the creaking steps of the porch, half expecting my foot to plunge through rotting planks. I pulled the brass key from my pocket, inserted it into the rusty deadbolt, and turned. It was stiff, but it clicked. I pushed the door open. The hinges shrieked in protest. The smell of stale air, mildew, and dust hit me instantly. I pulled out my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a living room frozen in time. Furniture was covered in thick, white canvas sheets, yellowed with age. Raccoon droppings littered the corners, and a thick layer of dust coated the hardwood floors. I walked slowly into the room, my footsteps echoing hollowly. "Dad," I mumbled, feeling foolish. As I swept my flashlight across the floor toward the kitchen, my breath caught in my throat. I stopped dead. The dust on the floor was thick, like a carpet of gray snow. But cutting straight through the middle of the living room, leading toward the back hallway, was a set of footprints. They weren't mine. Mine were flat treads of cheap sneakers by the door. These prints were large, deeply grooved, like heavy tactical boots, and the edges of the displaced dust were sharp. They were fresh. Someone had been here recently, within the last few days. My heart hammered against my ribs. The immediate thought was Victoria. If she suspected my father was hiding assets, she would have hired a private investigator. Had they beaten me here? Had they already stripped the place of whatever my father wanted me to find? I reached into my pocket and gripped my car keys, threading them between my knuckles as an improvised weapon. I moved as silently as possible, following the boot prints down the narrow hallway. They led into what appeared to be an old study. The canvas sheet had been violently ripped off a heavy oak desk. Drawers were pulled out, papers scattered across the floor. The intruder had been searching for something. I stepped over the mess, my mind racing. If they had found what they wanted, they wouldn't have left the place trashed. They were frustrated. They missed something. I remembered my father's note. "Look up." I shined my flashlight at the ceiling of the study. It was flat, ordinary drywall. I followed the boot prints back out into the hallway. They went up the stairs. I crept up the wooden steps, wincing at every groan of the floorboards. The second floor consisted of a small bathroom and a master bedroom. The boot prints paced around the bedroom, stopped at the closet, then headed back toward the stairs. The intruder had left. I walked into the master bedroom. It was bare except for a mattress on the floor and a walk-in closet with the door left wide open. I walked into the closet, feeling a cold draft brush against the back of my neck. "Look up." I aimed the beam of my phone straight up. The closet ceiling was paneled with cheap acoustic tiles, the kind from old office buildings, but one tile in the far corner, above a built-in wooden shelf, looked slightly off-center. There was a tiny gap, showing a sliver of darkness above. I climbed onto the wooden shelf, the wood groaning under my weight. I reached up and pressed my palms flat against the tile. I pushed. The tile lifted easily, sliding aside with a dusty scrape. A cascade of dry rot and dust fell into my eyes, making me cough. I waved the dust away and shined my light into the hole. There was a heavy aluminum drop-down ladder resting inside the opening. The intruder hadn't looked up. With shaking hands, I grabbed the bottom rung and pulled it down. It extended with metallic clanks that sounded like gunshots in the quiet house. I took a deep breath and began to climb into the pitch-black attic. The air up there was stifling, smelling heavily of cedar and old paper. I crested the opening and pulled myself onto the sturdy plywood floor. I stood, holding my phone out like a beacon. The attic was massive, spanning the entire length of the house. I swept the light from left to right, mostly empty, save for a few cardboard boxes. But as the beam hit the far corner, it reflected off something massive and metallic. A safe, not a small lockbox. A colossal 6-foot-tall brushed steel vault bolted directly into the load-bearing beams. It belonged in a high-security bank, not a rotting cabin in Wisconsin. I sprinted toward it, my boots thudding against the plywood. As I got closer, the sheer scale took my breath away. It had a heavy steel wheel and a digital keypad. But as my flashlight illuminated the front, my stomach dropped. The keypad had been smashed to pieces. Wires dangled uselessly. The thick steel surrounding the lock mechanism was scarred with deep blackened grooves. Someone had taken an angle grinder and sledgehammer to it. The intruder had found the safe. I fell to my knees, my heart shattering all over again. Victoria's goons had destroyed the lock. But as I looked closer, I noticed something taped to the side of the scorched metal. A pristine, sticky note with my father's handwriting. "Sammy, If the keypad is broken, look behind the panel. My fingers hovered over the note. I pulled my pocket knife, wedged the blade behind the shattered plastic, and pried. The ruined plastic popped off, sending shards clattering to the floor. Behind the housing, flush against the cold steel, was a perfectly round mechanical keyhole. I reached into my pocket. I pulled out the silver safety deposit box key. With trembling hands, I slid it into the hidden lock. It slid in effortlessly. I held my breath and turned it. Clack! A heavy, satisfying mechanical thud echoed from deep within the vault. I grabbed the massive steel wheel, braced my boots against the floor, and pulled. The hinges groaned, and the thick doors swung open. The beam of my flashlight illuminated the interior, and I actually had to brace myself to keep from falling. There was money, stacks of it. Shrink-wrapped bricks of $100 bills lined the bottom shelf alongside velvet pouches heavy with gold. It was a fortune. But my father was strategic. He knew cash alone wouldn't give me my life back. On the middle shelf sat a black leather journal, 2 encrypted hard drives, and a sealed manila envelope labeled with one word in my father's unmistakable scrawl: checkmate. I ripped open the envelope and pulled out documents. The first was a legally binding last will and testament dated 5 days before my father's death. In it, he left everything to me, explicitly disinheriting Victoria and Preston. But the second document made the blood freeze in my veins. A private toxicology report from an independent Swiss lab, along with printed emails. Victoria hadn't just manipulated business affairs. She had been killing him. The emails exposed how she and Ted Higgins had conspired to bribe one of our private nurses. For 8 months, they had been replacing my father's heart medication with a synthetic amphetamine compound, pushing his weakened heart to the brink. They had deliberately induced his coronary failure. My father had figured it out. His journal detailed his terrifying realization, how he secretly hired a private investigator, and how he scrambled to hide this vault before his heart finally gave out. He needed me to find the truth. I was so absorbed in the horror that I almost didn't hear it, the crunch of gravel outside. I snapped my flashlight off, plunging the attic into darkness. I crept to the grimy circular window and peered down. A black SUV had parked behind my Civic, blocking me in. A massive man in a dark trench coat stepped out. The boots. It was the intruder. Then the passenger door opened. A man with silver hair stepped into the rain holding an umbrella. It was Ted Higgins. "The kid's car's here," the heavy man said. "He must have found the deed." "Then he's inside," Ted replied, his voice cold and murderous. "Find him, Garrett. If he's seen what's in that safe, he doesn't leave these woods. Make it look like a break-in gone wrong." Panic seized my throat. I was 19, not a fighter, but looking at the journal in my hands, fury burned through my fear. They murdered my father. They threw me away like garbage. I was not going to let them win. I heard the front door being kicked open downstairs. Moving on instinct, I grabbed my empty backpack and shoved the gold, cash, hard drives, and toxicology reports inside. I strapped the bag to my chest. Heavy footsteps echoed below. "Check the study," Ted yelled. I had seconds. I couldn't use the ladder. I looked at the small circular ventilation window at the end of the attic, covered by wooden louvers, brittle and rotting. I scrambled across the plywood floor as Garrett's footsteps climbed the stairs. I reached the window, laid flat, and kicked the louvers with every ounce of strength. The wood shattered with a loud crack. "He's up there," Garrett yelled. The attic ladder screeched as it was pulled down. I squeezed through the broken window, splinters tearing my shirt and slicing my skin. I wriggled onto the steep A-frame roof. Rain made the moss-covered shingles slick. I immediately began to slide toward the edge, a 2-story drop below. I scrambled wildly, fingernails digging into rotting shingles, catching myself inches from the gutter. A flashlight beam cut through the attic. "He's on the roof!" Garrett bellowed. I saw the glint of a suppressed pistol. I rolled off the edge, plummeting through darkness into the thick canopy of a massive oak tree. Branches whipped across my face, tearing my clothes, bruising my ribs. I slammed into a thick limb, knocking the wind out of me before dropping the last 10 feet into wet ferns. Pain exploded in my ankle, but adrenaline numbed it. "Shoot him!" Ted screamed from the porch. Bark exploded from the oak trunk inches from my head. I scrambled to my feet and sprinted into the pitch-black forest. I ran for over an hour, navigating by moonlight, until I stumbled onto the paved county highway. Bleeding, soaked and shaking, I clutched the backpack to my chest. Just before dawn, a long-haul trucker picked me up. He took one look at my bruised face, asked no questions, and drove me straight to Chicago. I didn't go to local police. My father's journal warned of Ted's influence. Instead, at 8 a.m., I walked into the FBI field office. I demanded to speak to a federal agent regarding corporate conspiracy and murder involving a billion-dollar tech conglomerate. Agent Donovan, a veteran of white-collar crime, initially looked at me like a delusional runaway. But the moment I laid the Swiss toxicology reports, encrypted hard drives, and the real will on his desk, his expression shifted to stone-cold focus. The takedown was swift and entirely public. 3 days later, heavily armed federal agents raided the Lake Forest estate. I sat in an unmarked sedan down the street, watching through the rain-streaked window. The front doors were thrown open. Victoria, wearing her cashmere and diamonds, was escorted out in handcuffs, her face twisted in sheer disbelief. Preston was dragged out in silk pajamas, crying openly as he was shoved into a federal cruiser. Simultaneously, Ted Higgins was arrested during a high-profile board meeting. The hard drives contained irrefutable proof, financial transfers to the hitman, emails coordinating the medication tampering, and a massive offshore embezzlement scheme. It was over. 6 months later, the legal dust settled. The courts validated the true will, voiding Victoria's forged documents. She and Ted were indicted for first-degree murder, conspiracy, and federal wire fraud. They will spend the rest of their lives in federal prison. At 20 years old, I officially took control of my father's empire. I fired the corrupt board members, rebuilt the executive team with people my father trusted, and established a massive medical foundation in his name. But I didn't move back into the Lake Forest mansion. I sold it. It held too many ghosts. Instead, I used a fraction of my inheritance to renovate the old A-frame in Black River Falls. I fixed the roof, repainted the siding, and turned the attic into a sunlit library. Sometimes, when the corporate world gets too loud, I drive up to Wisconsin, sit by the fireplace, and look at my father's old green tackle box resting on the mantel. They thought they could break me. They thought stripping me of everything would leave me defenseless. But they forgot one crucial detail. I am Robert Wyatt's son. When you leave a Wyatt with nothing left to lose, you better be prepared for the storm they bring back. What an absolutely incredible journey of survival, betrayal, and ultimate justice. Samuel's story proves that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't just wealth, but the truth needed to fight back against the darkest of lies. If this thrilling story kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable real-life stories.